What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video talking about my experiences with Honor Mode for Baldur's Gate 3, which I most recently completed and got the achievement, of course, but also the golden dice that come along with it, and having covered just about everything else to do with that game, I figured it would be nice to sort of recap that experience in this video. With that in mind, this video is trying to do a lot of different things, talk about that experience specifically, give some general tips, talk about bosses, party comp, etc. So if it is a little rambly, you'll have to forgive me, but I did try to somewhat order it at least. Now, to begin with here, I would like to talk about my personal run-through, how that sort of changed and evolved over the course of it. And in broad terms, I would say that as far as the actual difficulty goes, it is very similar to Tactician with a few extra caveats, of course. And while I did find a lot of the bosses, at least until the third act, to be a little underwhelming with their new mechanics, a lot of them could still just be bursted down, for instance, though there were some exceptions that we'll get into. What I would say stuck with me the most about Honor Mode was, of course, having to actually roll with a lot of your bad decisions one way or the other, which definitely affected my own personal playthrough on the transition from Act 2 into 3. And while you could always avoid save scumming, this particular mode, keeping only one save file that you can only load into from the main menu and it saves upon every exit, even a crash, means that that temptation is gone as well because it's not something you can do. Even for large mistakes that really mess up your entire party, for instance, you're forced to just roll with it or lose the playthrough, basically. And that was much more impactful than the actual difficulty, as it is not that different from Tactician in a lot of ways. Because in this mode, every single dice roll now has a much greater weight to it, which led to, in my case, more thoughtful planning. Now, to break that down a little bit more specifically by act, as I mentioned in my initial impressions of Honor Mode video, Act 1 was largely the same as pretty much every other time I've ran Act 1, especially on Tactician, as most of the new boss mechanics just didn't really matter, as my usual playstyle kind of already countered what they were trying to do, with two notable exceptions for myself. The Spider Matriarch will entomb your characters if you attack one of her children before she is dead, which caught me a little bit off guard and caused one of my characters to die, but I was able to recover from that one pretty easily just by knocking her off the ledge and kind of just line of sighting the ability. But by far the biggest one, I would say, was Grim. The construct at the bottom of the Grim Forge was in Honor Mode given, I would say, a relatively small tweak to the fight that changes it entirely. Normally, he walks about half the length of this big circle, which puts him right into position of the big hammer, and when he's superheated from the lava, you then hit him with the hammer, it deals a bunch of damage, and you're good to go. Even on Tactician, that's how that works. However, here on Honor Mode, anytime he is hit, which is how he decides his target, he now gains a small temporary health shield that, when broken, causes a bunch of damage and has his movement doubled, which means it's much harder to get him lined up on the hammer. And in order to circumvent this, you essentially have to get somebody on the platform of the hammer specifically, have that person hit Grim to force him to the center without overshooting it, and then ideally Misty Step away before activating the hammer so you don't die. And while that's a very simple mechanic to adjust for once you actually know it's coming, for instance, I could just use summons to do that in the future, walking into it blind was quite the experience. I walked away from that fight with only one character standing at incredibly minimal health. I'm actually pretty surprised I didn't lose my playthrough here. Now from there, for me, the challenge didn't really pick up much until late into Act 2, but I did want to mention one in particular that a lot of people talk about losing their playthrough to, which is the Githyanki Inquisitor in the Kresh in the Mountain Pass. This was another boss I just didn't really struggle with. I killed him in 2 turns, but his ability causes him to summon swords when he's attacked, but the trick here is that those die when he does, so I just focused him down really fast and then his swords died and I just moved on to cleanup. I've always found that the trick with that fight, even on Tactician, is to not wait until he attacks you, but rather attack him first. But Act 2 is where things got particularly interesting, because Act 2 is filled with several optional bosses that you can talk down without fighting, provided you can pass a bunch of checks. Now, normally that's fine, but in Honor Mode it's much more difficult, because if you fail those checks, you, of course, have to actually fight the boss, and those bosses are where the legendary actions that they get started being much more compelling. For instance, the Toll Collector has an ability called Sublimation that once per round lets her essentially just one-shot someone anytime you remove her armor, that is to say kill one of her visages, which is obviously a very deadly ability, but she's also the easiest one to talk down, so it's pretty easily avoided. whereas the Doctor's legendary action sees him using his nurses to create a big confusion field that causes the loss of control of your characters. And on top of that, he's got a pretty high health pool as well for this period, meaning that fight can be particularly deadly, though of course you would just want to avoid it altogether when possible, but otherwise keep the nurses from being brought back to life as much as possible, though he will res them throughout the fight, to avoid being confused. And the third optional boss is much the same, a very deadly combat ability if you can't avoid the fight altogether. Now, outside of those three, a lot of bosses I thought I might struggle with wound up kind of just being a cakewalk, such as Balthazar. If you can pass a check, he will give you his flesh golem to summon into combat while you try to help him, supposedly. But if you take that opportunity to instead eliminate the flesh golem, you can then fight him without it. And while his legendary action is pretty substantial in that it will give him a bunch of immunities and resistances, if you have something that deals force damage, for instance, it's pretty easy to deal away with his kind of measly 100 health at that point, which makes him a pretty easy fight. In the same area, though, we have Urgir, the big demon Raphael wants you to fight. This was another one that kind of surprised me with how easy it wound up being. I was able to sneak up on him and just kill him in one round, so he never got the chance to do anything, and then you just clean up his minions. Now, the last fight of Act 2 was the one I was stressing about the most, which is the big fight with the Apostle of Merkel. But the thing with this fight is that I wound up over-preparing a little bit. If you are unaware, while most people will probably be in this fight at level 8 or 9, ideally level 9 at least, it's actually possible to get to level 10 before this fight, which is difficult, but you can manage it. And if you're running, say, Gale, as an evocation wizard, level 10 is a big level for you because it turns just regular old magic missile into a very heavy-hitting attack. And you combine that with a speed potion to give Gale 2 actions, and you can hit the Apostle of Merkel with really beefed up magic missile spells that will take out like half his health in a round. That is guaranteed to hit, and you've suddenly got a very easy fight on your hand where you don't have to worry about, say, a Paladin Smite missing. But after this is where things took a bit of a turn. You see, my initial playthrough, I was using the Dark Urge origin to, ahead of time, make the fight with Orin a little bit easier. However, something about the Dark Urge is that they occasionally have to make checks against their urge that I unfortunately failed, which means I killed one of my main party members, Lae'zel, and I was unable to do anything about it. Now, this really put a damper on my plans as I had stacked very important things on Lae'zel, such as permanent bonuses that I could not get back, which means that replacing her even with a hireling wasn't going to give me the same level of power. So going into Act 3, I was left with a decision. Try to tackle some of those boss fights, or play it very safe and go for the ending and get the reward, which is ultimately what I chose. But the thing about Act 3 is that by the time you get there, you are more than prepared to take on pretty much all the trash fights. But if you are using Gale in your party and you are willing to, of course, forego optimal quest outcomes, there's only actually one fight in Act 3 that is required, which is Orin. And if you're using the Dark Urge, and you've taken the Slayer form for yourself, that fight is exceptionally easy, as you can simply paralyze her and destroy her. So while I certainly took the easy way out, a lot of the legendary actions on bosses get a lot more, I would say, dangerous in Act 3 in particular, because this is where you'll see things like abilities that can just outright kill you in a single hit, either due to just the sheer damage that they deal, or just literally the description just says it kills you. So admittedly took the easy way out on Act 3, but my point in telling you that, and as we'll get to as we're about to hit the tips and tricks section, so to speak, is that pretty much anybody can do that. It's not difficult at all to avoid almost every significant boss fight in Act 3. If you have Gale, you can avoid the last boss altogether, so on and so forth. Basically, the challenge is getting to Act 3 more so than Act 3 itself, provided, of course, all you want is the rewards. Now, moving on to the tips and tricks section. I'm going to break this down by act and just talk about things that were generally very helpful. And while the single save file means that these things might not necessarily work due to a bad roll or just flat out bad luck, etc. But starting with Act 1. Act 1 is likely where you'll struggle the most because the early levels are the most prone to RNG, both in combat but also various abilities that are available to you as a character because your levels are so low. This means that the bulk of Act 1 largely plays the same way it does like in Tactician. However, you simply can't reload a save. Now, the downside to this is obviously that it's very easy to die through what is honestly not really any fault of yours per se, just flat out bad dice rolls. But really, the approach from Tactician doesn't change here much besides waiting to take on the bosses until the appropriate time. Things like fighting the Owlbear, fighting Auntie Ethel, the Spider Matriarch, etc. You'll probably want to avoid those as much as possible or stack the deck extremely in your favor before even trying to do them, and preferably being at least level 5. This also means avoiding early difficult fights, such as the fight with the Harpies near the Grove. That fight is a giant pain until you are at least level 4, and with only one save, you probably don't want to risk that one. So basically, the tricks for Act 1 is simply being very choosy about when and where you do the content. Focus more on leveling up than clearing encounters or individual bits of content, while also trying to make the best choices possible. Generally, I'd recommend going the good route, so to speak, that is to say siding with the Grove, but also going for the optimal outcomes there, such as preventing Kaga from siding with the Shadow Druids, basically exposing her plot, but also convincing her to side with you to make that fight really easy, which also preserves all the Tieflings who can give you quest rewards in Act 2. This also opens up the opportunity to steal the Idol of the Grove without causing a panic and an attack between the Tieflings and the Druids, to then turn in for your Ring of Protection, which is the best quest reward in Act 1. Now, another thing you'll notice pretty quickly in Honor Mode is that the prices of various goods have been adjusted. A lot of the really popular items from vendors have had their prices massively increased, and while that does make things a little more difficult to obtain gold-wise, it is still possible to do so, either by hoovering up and selling everything you can get your hands on, including normally junk items you wouldn't bother with, or alternatively, though much riskier, is simply stealing it. You can have somebody like Astarion, for instance, pop an invisibility potion or use a scroll or something to then go easily pickpocket that item off of the vendor and then do it for free. Though my only advice there is don't hang around too long. After you pickpocket someone, after a short period passes, they will notice something is missing and then they'll start questioning people around. But if you're not there to be discovered, it doesn't matter. But broadly speaking, Act 1 is largely about just trying to level up and avoiding things until you're ready to take them on, which includes fights like Grimm. Grimm is a very challenging fight in Act 1, but there's also not really a lot of reason to fight him. While his rewards are very good at the time that you can fight him, they're also not really required for anything either. You'll get better stuff than all of that later on, and it might simply be easier to just pass the guy by. But if you insist on fighting him, bring some summon scrolls or something so you can draw him to the center of the hammer much easier, as his new shield doing shockwave damage makes the regular approach of just hitting him while he's superheated with blunt weapons dangerous. Now, towards the end of Act 1 and going into the mountain pass is where it's probably worth talking about something a little more specific. It's difficult to pull off, especially if you're using a whole party, which you probably are in Honor Mode, but that is foregoing resting for the sake of preserving buffs. You see, the end of Act 1 has several buffs that are going to last until you long rest, but they are huge buffs, such as the Bliss Spores from the Myconid colony. These give a plus 1d6 bonus to your attack rolls, abilities checks, etc., which is absolutely massive, but that only lasts until you long rest. However, it is possible to forego that a little bit by simply not resting. This means using classes that don't need to rest, such as a ranger for instance, and relying more on scrolls than your spell slots. Another example of this is getting the Lathander's Light buff from solving the first half of the Blood of Lathander puzzle in the Rosy Morn Monastery, which grants your weapon attacks 1d4 radiant damage until you long rest. Preserving multiple of those buffs at the same time by running a party that doesn't need to rest as often can be really useful to power your way through a few boss fights. It is not explicitly speaking required, but if you can pull it off, it is very, very helpful. And it also forces the RNG in your favor for things like ability checks, which Bliss Spores also affects, which can make it much easier to pass otherwise difficult checks on a single save file. Now that brings me to some tips and ideas, at least for Act 2. Now, the first and most obvious one is that if you can pass the checks to deal with the optional bosses without actually having to fight them, do so. You'll get great rewards, all the experience, and you won't even risk the loss. But all three of those bosses have very high health pools for that time, so I would mostly try to avoid them until you're getting ready to wrap up that act. to give yourself the best chance possible, but you do need to deal with them. Though if you know exactly what type of check you need to pass, or the ones you want to pass to make that happen, you can just go hire a hireling and give them bonuses to the exact roll you need to make, and then combined with some inspiration, you can probably force it without too much trouble, as it's not all that difficult. Now, another tip is for Balthazar and Urgir, like I talked about already. Balthazar, you want to separate him from his flesh golem, and you want to kill Balthazar in the Temple of Shar. Do not side with Balthazar, it leads to a much more difficult fight later. It is infinitely easier to kill him in the temple. Just separate his golem from him by passing the check for the bell, summon the golem elsewhere in the dungeon, kill him. It's actually most easily done right outside his room by just closing the door, and then Balthazar won't aggro from that. After which, Balthazar himself is really easy to kill in one turn if you're using something like force damage because he has a very low health pool total. Urgir, you don't need to fight. You can actually do his side quest, which is arguably a little easier if you have a solid AoE firewall, for instance, but you want that experience either way. Now, another tip for Act 2, though, is actually to, once you are ready to end the act, but before you actually do, go kill everyone in Moonrise Towers, especially if you are going the good route. Because normally, at the end of Act 2, if you went the side of good, you have to fight a huge wave of enemies in Moonrise Towers, but if you can systematically take them out one by one, this will either A, simply reduce the numbers of that final wave you'll have to deal with, or if you can take all of them out confidently, you can avoid that fight altogether. If you're unaware, you can actually attack people in Moonrise Towers and it will not aggro the entire tower. It will only aggro the people in sight and of course near the fighting, and you can use that to your advantage to systematically take them all out. And if you do that buff stacking thing like I talked about earlier with the buffs from Shar's statues in the middle of town in Act 2, which will give you +5 to your mental stats, you can even make that a little bit easier. Now for the Act 2 final boss with the Apostle of Merkel, as I mentioned, the best strategy here is to do everything you can to hit level 10, especially with an evocation wizard in the party, because this will make magic missiles a nuke that will easily destroy this boss. Otherwise, you're kind of forced to deal with hoping you hit him with something like a Paladin Smite, which will also get the job done, which is why Dame Island is there. It's also really helpful if you can sneak your entire party closer up to the platform before that starts. And then here in this example, I was actually able to distract him with a summon as well. And this way I could set up the battlefield for what I wanted to do before the fight actually starts and we trigger the cutscene with Ketheric. This is going to allow you to say pop an invisibility potion and go over and free Dame Island before the fight even starts, which lets you then focus down the ads before moving on to phase 2 with the Apostle. It is important to note, however, that Ketheric takes very reduced damage from magic missiles. Don't use them on him, use them on the Apostle. Also focus down the Mind Flayer first, it will charm your party members and you'll lose turns. But that brings us to my Act 3 tips. Act 3 is where you need to decide if you want the rewards or if you want the challenge, because Act 3 is as easy or as hard as you'd like to make it. The only mandatory boss fight in Act 3 is Orin. In order to skip the last boss fight, you can have Gale use his Netherese Orb to deal with that entire fight in dialogue. If you've been encouraging Gale to do so, or basically side with Mystra, so to speak, he'll do this without a check. If you've been letting him be his own person in roleplay, that is to say, like pumping him up to instead go for the Crown of Karsus, you'll have to pass a pretty sizable persuasion check to make that happen, which means throughout the game it's easier to talk Gale into doing what Mystra wants, so you can skip the last boss fight. Otherwise, the tips for Act 3 are simply do the easy content that is high XP rewards, such as clearing Cazador's mansion up to the Cazador fight. All of the fights and NPCs in Cazador's mansion give a ridiculous amount of XP for very little effort, which furthers our goal in Act 3 of simply hitting level 12, getting geared, fighting Orin, and then making a break for the last boss. Now, if you're wondering how you skip the Gortash fight, that's actually pretty easy. He offers you a deal towards the start of the act. Simply agree to his deal, and he'll keep his end of the bargain if you don't give him the Netherstones from the other bosses. This enables you to skip the fight with Gortash altogether, and the fight with his Steel Watchers at the Foundry, and then he dies in a cutscene off-screen later. Karlach isn't wild about this plan, but she will go along with it if you're worried about that. Now, in order to get to Orin, you're going to have to deal with the Murder Tribunal and Saravok. If you are playing the Dark Urge character, this is a fight you can skip simply by being the Dark Urge, otherwise you'll have to pass a check to become an unholy assassin. But basically, if you prove your worth as a murderer to the murder tribunal, they will let you pass without a fight, which is obviously the easiest way to go. Pretty much every other boss in Act 3 is also completely optional, so whether or not you go fight them is simply up to you. But now let's talk about the fight with Orin in particular. This is easily done by being a Dark Urge character, as it is a one-on-one fight that you can easily skew in your favor. If you're with an entire party, obviously your mileage is going to vary a little bit here, but with a Dark Urge character, especially if you got the Slayer form from Act 2, which you can easily do by letting a companion die or killing Isabel, and if you wait until you've done the rest of the act, that is to say all of the Harpers have moved to Moonrise Tower, you can then double back and kill Isabel pretty much without any significant repercussion. That is to say, leading to harder fights. Doing either of those things will give you access to the Slayer form, which means Orin doesn't have it for this fight. And when she's in her human form, she is very susceptible to paralyze. And while on Honor mode, she does give a big +10 bonus to crowd control options, there is a necklace you can get in Act 2 that lets you guarantee a paralyze effect on a critical hit. You can also guarantee a critical hit through abilities like Luck of the Far Realms or the Killer's Sweetheart Ring, which you can also get in Act 2. This means that if you have a character with a high initiative, it's very easy to get the first turn, guarantee a critical hit on Orin, as a result a guarantee paralyze as well, which makes killing her exceptionally easy. Which means compared to Act 2 and 1, Act 3 is pretty much a breeze if you're playing a Dark Urge character and you have Gale with you to get rid of the last boss. Now from there, to wrap this video up, I want to talk a little bit about party composition. Now for the most part, any party composition that works for Tactician should work here, as much of it is largely the same. There's just going to be slight differences with certain bosses that you'll want to be aware of, but otherwise it'll all work. So with that in mind, I used a Battlemaster Fighter, an Evocation Wizard, a Gloomstalker Ranger combo that I used for my solo Tactician build, and the Bard build that I made for Astarion. Right away, the Bard build that I used for Astarion. That's a video you can find on the channel. I'll try to link it down below if I remember. But while I did enjoy that, I would say that in retrospect, having played through this fully now, I would actually swap that character out for Shadowheart as my Terror of Tiamat build after Act 1. Basically use him for Act 1, and then when you get to Act 2, swap that character out. As my Terror of Tiamat build is also very effective, even after a few nerfs it got since launch, and that support character would have been more useful than that Bard build, even though I did manage to make it work. If I were to change something, if I did this again, that would be it. Now, when it comes to the Evocation Wizard and the Battlemaster Fighter, those two subclasses are very, very strong all on their own. You don't really need to do anything special to them to make them work. You just need to know how to play them and you're pretty much good to go. Which is handy because Gale is by default an Evocation Wizard and Lae'zel is by default a Battlemaster Fighter. You don't need to multi-class, you don't need to do anything special. These two subclasses are exceptionally strong, and you can usually tailor them to your exact situation. Now, where things get a little more complicated, because I haven't made a build video on it, is my solo Tactician build that I used, which was a combination Gloomstalker Assassin. This is not, I would say, a particularly original idea to me. It is a common enough multi-class, because Gloomstalker and Assassin complement each other very well, and it uses some other popular things like the dual crossbow setup. But to give a brief rundown of it, you take Ranger right at character creation, make sure you take Dexterity to 17. I used a half-orc for their Relentless Endurance ability because Honor mode, but honestly it's not that important. You could use pretty much any race for this. And for their abilities, you want to pick up Urban Tracker. This is going to give you sleight of hand proficiency, etc. That's going to let you basically take Astarion's role of the lockpicker. And then you're going to level up as a ranger until level 5. Early game Hunter's Mark is pretty good, but its usefulness falls off later. In Act 1, you're pretty much focused on getting the dual crossbows set up, which you can buy from a vendor usually. That is to say 2 one-handed crossbows. For their fighting style at level 2, you want to pick up 2 weapon fighting and not archery. This was a recent nerf to the ability to the two-handed crossbows, but they're still very useful. But at level 2, pick up 2 weapon fighting, and you can add your dexterity modifier to your offhand crossbow when you attack. At level 4, you're going to take the ability improvement feat and put 2 more into dexterity, bringing it up to 19. With the anti-Ethel fight, you want to bring her close to death but not kill her, triggering her surrender dialogue, which lets you exchange a quest reward for her safety basically, and she'll give you the Hag Hair quest reward. This gives you a +1 modifier to the ability score of your choice. We're going to pick dexterity to bring our dexterity up to 20. At level 5, this character gets extra attack, which means we can attack again with our main hand weapon, which is handy on its own. Now, at level 3, you obviously pick up Gloomstalker. This is important because we're about to transition into Rogue at level 6. Gloomstalkers get a bonus to initiative. They get an ability called Dread Ambusher, which lets them get an extra attack with extra damage on the first turn of combat, which is all pretty good. Then at level 6, we go into Rogue. This is going to give us extra sneak attack damage, which is nice, but we're pretty much just going to level this up to level 8 as Rogue until we take our Assassin subclass. This allows us to do 2 things. 1, get our action points refunded when we start combat from outside of combat, that is to say we attack someone, and then when it transitions into combat, we get those actions back, allowing us to make more attacks at the start of combat, which works really well with Gloomstalker. What's more, if you can surprise enemies while doing this, it makes this guaranteed critical hits, which means the first turn or so of combat, you can deal insane amounts of damage just from that alone. But we're going to go a little bit farther. We're going to put 1 more level in Rogue to bring it up to level 9, which will give you a second feat. This one is truthfully mostly dealer's choice. I personally like to take Alert right here to add even more to our initiative and basically make sure we always get the first turn in combat, which is going to be very important for Honor Mode. We want 0 enemies, even other bosses, to get a chance to get more initiative than us, so we can make full use of our Gloomstalker Assassin combo. And then for our last 3 levels, we're actually going to dip into Fighter for this. This allows us to take a second fighting style right at level 10 there, and you can either put it into archery or defense. Either one will work. At level 2 fighter, which means level 11, we'll get action surge, which is obviously super useful for everyone, and just gives us more attacks right at the start of combat, especially for bosses. And then for our level 3 fighter, we pick a subclass, and for this I would actually recommend champion, just to give you the extra critical range, which is about the only useful thing you're going to get at level 12 for this build. You could conceivably go Eldritch Knight for shield, perhaps, but realistically, you don't need it at this point in the game. And you already have a Battlemaster Fighter, which makes the maneuvers unnecessary. Now, in terms of gear, there's a few important pieces. By the end of Act 1, you want 2 +1 hand crossbows. You can get these from Damon, actually, in Act 1. You can also find 1 or 2 here and there. That's about as well as you're going to do weapon-wise, but you want to pick up the archery bracers from the Goblin at the Goblin Camp. These will give you plus to damage with each of your ranged attacks, and it doesn't actually mention it on the item, but it gives you a plus to your attack rolls as well, making you more likely to hit. Ideally, you're playing this character as the Dark Urge, which gives you access to the invisibility cape, because that is deeply broken, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. For your helmet, it's basically the best you can get until the end of Act 1, where you want to pick up the Diadem of Arcane Synergy from the Githyanki Inquisitor fight. Anytime you apply a condition, you'll get a buff to your character that applies your casting modifier to your damage, that is to say your weapon attacks, which means our wisdom buff that we'll get for being a ranger, as we get a small bit of spell casting as a ranger, gets added on to our regular damage, giving us just a little bit extra. Another big one is your chest piece though. For the most part, we're going to be wearing medium armor until Act 2, when you can pick up the Yonti scale mail from the vendor at the Last Light Inn. This allows us to get our full dexterity modifier despite it being medium armor, which means come Act 2, if you're stacking things properly with things like the Ring of Protection, the quest reward from stealing the idol in Act 1, and a couple other sources, you can easily get your AC to like 24 to 26 in Act 2, depending on your exact gear setup. And then in Act 3, you're actually going to swap this out for the Armor of Agility, which you can get from the vendor by the Sorceress Sundry shop. which does the same thing as the Yuan-Ti Scale Mail, but has a higher base AC, which is going to bring it up even more. If you stack all of that together, this build is a monster by level 8, and you'll start just destroying things as combat even starts. Which brings me finally to my last few tips for you that are a little more general in nature, but kind of require you to do specific things. For starters, some enemies can be attacked from outside of the range at which they can detect you, which means you can keep attacking them until they finally notice you. This is especially noticeable in Act 2, where you can do it multiple times due to the height at which you can attack things from. And that will allow you to take out enemies without even putting yourself in any kind of danger. Not always available, but very useful when it is. Another really useful thing are potions of Angelic Reprieve and potions of Angelic Slumber. These allow you to take a short rest or a long rest for a single character, respectively. But the catch is, these actually don't reset your long rest buffs, meaning that if you use one of these on, say, a spellcaster, they can get their spell slots back without actually clearing any buffs from things like elixirs, etc. that last until long rest normally. This is what is going to allow you to push off resting as much as possible to help you stack otherwise temporary buffs. Which brings me to my final tip, and that is exploiting the way invisibility works. You can mostly do this solo, but it does technically work with a party as well. It just requires more work. That said, you can, of course, at any time separate a single character from the party and have them go do this. Invisibility in combat is busted, though, meaning that if you are actively in combat with something and then you turn invisible, the battlefield will be marked with your last known location to the enemy. If you then take that character and run away from that location before passing your turn back to the enemies, they will then go investigate where they last knew you were. They will then activate an ability that every enemy has called Detecting Hidden Presence. If that ability, if you want to call it that, fails, the marker of your last known location goes away, and if you're the only target that that enemy had, combat drops, which allows you to reset combat. This is both useful for getting away from enemies, but also resetting certain abilities. You see a lot of the Gloomstalker Assassin combo that we just talked about in the build section there works off of the start of combat with the Gloomstalker's abilities and the Assassin's surprise criticals. So dropping combat via that invisibility cheese allows you to effectively reset those bonuses and attacks, which means you can then start combat again and deal a ton of damage round 1, usually in the ballpark of 100 to 200 damage plus, which will likely allow you to kill something. This is where the Dark Urge Invisibility Cape comes in, because that turns you invisible once per turn when you kill something, which means it's very easy to perform this cheese. This is a primary tactic used in solo tactician stuff. It makes a lot of fights that would otherwise be extremely difficult actually possible. And it even works on bosses. But with all of that said, that finally brings me to the end of this particular video and kind of wrapping it up. Overall, I would say Honor Mode was certainly an experience. It required me to use all the knowledge I had gained from my previous playthroughs, of course, about the various outcomes of certain decisions, which is why, in general, I wouldn't recommend you even trying Honor Mode until you've played through the game a couple times, if only to save yourself some frustration. But what wound up being more impactful than anything else was simply the single save file and being forced to deal with the consequences of my own actions or simply bad RNG. That made for a much more memorable playthrough where you're forced to adjust on the fly as opposed to the regular difficulty where you can save scum. And while, yes, you could always hold yourself to that standard, it's really easy to save scum even when there's like a big problem that you suddenly have to deal with and you'd rather just go back and try something again to avoid that, as opposed to just save scumming little random rolls that might not otherwise have a huge impact. And because of that, I found that aspect of the Honor Mode run much more substantial than the rest of it. Because in terms of combat, if you're willing to go the extra steps and prepare and get ready for it, do a little min-maxing, it likely won't pose that much of a challenge, as a lot of the fights aren't fundamentally changed, or the legendary actions function in such a way that simply bursting that boss down through a variety of high damage builds makes that action irrelevant anyway. In essence, while I really enjoyed Honor Mode because it was the higher difficulty that I had been asking for, what I wound up enjoying most about it had nothing to do with the actual difficulty changes, but rather rolling with the punches in terms of the various outcomes of certain decisions. But that's not without its cons though. While I appreciate a forced single save file here to, again, kind of just remove the temptation of dealing with any of that, even if I have seen all of this already, that single save save file also comes with problems. That is to say, bugs, a very inopportune save that forces you into a bug, for instance, which has the potential to lead you into a very painful loss of potentially dozens of hours of work into an honor mode playthrough to something that wasn't even necessarily your fault, which is obviously going to suck, but I think things like that are ultimately what add to the weight of an honor mode playthrough. So all in all, honor mode was a lot of fun. It was a very memorable playthrough, and while there are little things I would like to see changed, for instance, there's a lot of mini bosses that don't have extra mechanics at all, I think overall it's in a great spot. And it adds that little bit of extra difficulty that I think the game needed without it being insurmountable to anyone who's particularly dedicated. And with that, I think that's pretty much going to wrap up this video. That's about all I've got to say on honor mode and my thoughts on it. But if you have any further questions, by all means, drop them down in the comment section below and I'll be sure to answer them if someone else doesn't do it first. But in the meantime, that's pretty much going to do it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts on all this. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.